Part 1. The Myth of Luck. The name echoes through history like a legend, Lucky Luciano. It conjures images of a gangster who survived impossible odds, who dodged bullets and escaped death through sheer fortune. The newspapers loved the nickname. Hollywood embraced it. Even today, nearly 60 years after his death, the name Lucky Luciano represents the ultimate criminal survivor, a man blessed by fate itself. But the truth is far more interesting and far more sinister than the myth. Charles Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in 1997 in Sicily, probably did more to create the modern American Mafia and the National Criminal Syndicate than any other single man. He didn't stumble into power through luck. He calculated every move, engineered every betrayal, and built an empire through cold, ruthless intelligence. The nickname itself is a masterpiece of misdirection. It is not clear how Luciano earned the nickname Lucky. It may have come from surviving a severe beating and throat slashing by 3 men in 1929, or it may have been attributed to his luck at gambling or to a simple mispronunciation of his last name. But the most revealing detail is this: Luciano already had the nickname before the 1929 attack that supposedly gave it to him. In reality, Luciano cultivated the image of a lucky man because it served his purposes. Let people think he was fortunate. Let them believe fate favored him. Meanwhile, he would outthink them, outmaneuver them, and eliminate them with surgical precision. Luciano emigrated with his parents from Sicily to New York City in 1906, and at the age of 10 was already involved in mugging, shoplifting, and extortion. Even as a child, he understood something fundamental. Crime was a business, and like any business, it required strategy, organization, and careful planning. While in school, he started one of his first rackets, getting his schoolmates to pay him for protection for 10 cents a week. This wasn't the impulsive violence of a street thug. This was entrepreneurship applied to extortion. He identified a market, frightened school children, created a product, protection, and established a payment system. At 10 years old, Luciano was already thinking like a CEO. He met a Jewish boy named Meyer Lansky who refused to be bullied, and they became lifelong friends. This friendship would prove crucial. Where other Italian gangsters saw only ethnic divisions, Luciano saw opportunity. Lansky was smart, connected, and fearless. Together, they would build something unprecedented. At age 14, Luciano dropped out of school, and by 1916 he spent 6 months in jail for selling heroin. He was arrested 25 times between 1916 and 1936, but spent almost no time in prison. Was this luck, or was it the result of careful corruption, strategic bribes, and knowing exactly which palms to grease and which officials could be controlled? By the 1920s, Prohibition had created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. By 1925, Luciano was grossing over $12 million per year and made a personal income of about $4 million per year from running illegal gambling and bootlegging operations in New York that also extended into Philadelphia. $4 million annually in 1925. That's equivalent to roughly $60 million today. This wasn't luck. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise run with business acumen that would have impressed legitimate corporate executives. In 1920, he joined the ranks of New York's rising crime boss, Joe Masseria, and by 1925, he had become Masseria's chief lieutenant, directing bootlegging, prostitution, narcotics distribution, and other rackets. Luciano studied his boss carefully. He noted Masseria's strengths:
ruthlessness, territorial control, the ability to command respect through violence, and he noted Maseria's weaknesses: old-world thinking, ethnic prejudices, poor management skills, excessive greed. Luciano was learning, observing, calculating, and waiting for his moment. He started living at the Barbizon Plaza Hotel in 1927, living under the alias Charles Lane. Even his living arrangements were strategic, using an alias, maintaining multiple residences, creating layers of protection between his criminal activities and his daily life. The mythology surrounding Lucky Luciano obscures the reality of what he was: a criminal genius who revolutionized organized crime in America. He took the chaotic, violent world of street gangs and ethnic mobs and transformed it into a structured, profitable national organization. He studied his enemies, anticipated their moves, and eliminated them before they realized they were in danger. The nickname Lucky was perfect camouflage. While rivals dismissed him as fortunate, he was orchestrating their downfall. While law enforcement celebrated their occasional victories against him, he was corrupting the very system designed to contain him. While the public read sensational newspaper accounts of his narrow escapes, he was building an empire that would outlast him by generations. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about calculation, intelligence, and the cold-blooded pragmatism of a man who understood power better than almost anyone in American history.
Part 2. The Attack That Built a Legend. In October 1929, Luciano became the rare gangster to survive a one-way ride. He was abducted by 4 men in a car, beaten, stabbed repeatedly with an ice pick, had his throat slit from ear to ear, and was left for dead on a Staten Island beach, but survived. This incident has become the cornerstone of the Lucky Luciano legend. The story has been told and retold, embellished with each retelling until it's difficult to separate fact from mythology. But examining the details reveals something fascinating. Even this supposedly lucky survival may have been calculated. Officer Henry A. Blank discovered the mysterious man about 6 a.m. on October 17, 1929. The victim, in a bewildered state, had not identified himself yet. He asked if he was in New Jersey and presented the cop with a deal. "Get me a cab and I'll give you $50. Consider that response. A man who has been beaten, stabbed, and had his throat cut, supposedly left for dead, is conscious enough to try to bribe a police officer. Not to seek help, not to identify his attackers, but to avoid official involvement entirely. This isn't the behavior of a lucky survivor. This is the calculated response of a criminal who understands that police involvement creates complications. Detective Gustav Schley questioned the patient, who revealed himself to be Charles Lucania. The detective asked him who would have committed such an assault. Lucania was largely evasive. However, he did divulge that after receiving a call from a woman to meet with him, he stood at the corner of 50th Street and 6th Avenue in Manhattan when a sedan full of assailants kidnapped him at gunpoint. Luciano gave police almost nothing useful. He couldn't identify his attackers. He had no idea who ordered the hit. He was simply an innocent victim of random violence. This stance, total non-cooperation, would become his trademark response to law enforcement for the rest of his life. Lucky's version of events on the night of October 16, 1929, varied over the years, depending on with whom he spoke to. He told the original investigators that he had no idea who abducted and beat him, but it was 3 men. Sometimes he told the story as though 2 or 4 men manhandled him. The inconsistencies are revealing. If this were truly a traumatic near-death experience, wouldn't the details be seared into his memory? But Luciano told different versions to different people,
suggesting that the truth served no purpose for him. The attack itself was real, the scars were visible evidence, but the story of the attack became a tool, shaped and reshaped depending on the audience. According to Luciano, the kidnappers were cops, racket squad cops to be exact. He admitted that shortly after he recovered from the assault, he put out the word that he'd pay them back. However, once another carload of men tried to pay him a follow-up visit, Lucky quickly issued a retraction. This version, that corrupt police officers attacked him, is particularly interesting. If true, it explains why he never cooperated with the investigation. You don't call the police when the police are your attackers. But it also raises questions. Why would police want to torture Luciano in 1929? What information were they seeking, and why would they leave him alive to testify against them? Sometimes he told others that it was cops behind it, seeking information on his criminal cohort, Jack Legs Diamond. This is the version he remained most consistent in telling. Diamond was one of the most notorious gangsters of the era, a violent psychopath who had made enemies throughout the underworld. If police were looking for Diamond, pressuring Luciano made sense, but again, why leave him alive? Another theory emerged over the years. For quite some time, the evildoers were considered to be fellow gangsters, sent on the order of Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano, the Sicilian boss who would later declare himself boss of all bosses, had reason to test Luciano's loyalty or eliminate a potential rival. But here's where the calculation becomes apparent. Regardless of who attacked him, cops, rival gangsters, or someone else entirely, Luciano transformed a brutal assault into a career-defining moment. The young cop who found Luciano in 1929 gave an interview in 1962. He recalled returning to the scene after taking Luciano to the hospital. He found the impressions of both male and female shoe prints in the sand, along with wire and adhesive tape. Female shoe prints. This detail suggests the woman who called to arrange the meeting wasn't just a lure, she may have been present during the attack. It indicates planning, coordination, multiple participants. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment assault. Someone had carefully orchestrated it. The most remarkable aspect of the October 1929 attack is how Luciano used it. According to Mafia legend, they left him for dead on New York's Staten Island, but miraculously he survived, albeit with facial scars and a droopy eye. It's believed that his nickname Lucky came from surviving this horrific incident. The scars became his trademark. The droopy eyelid gave him a distinctive, menacing appearance. The story of survival became his legend, and the nickname Lucky became armor, a way to deflect attention from his intelligence and strategic thinking. People who think you're lucky underestimate you. They attribute your success to chance rather than skill. They don't prepare adequately to face you because they believe fortune, not calculation, is on your side. Lucky Luciano understood this instinctively. The attack that should have killed him instead became the foundation of a career that would serve him for decades. That's not luck. That's the brilliant exploitation of circumstances, turning near death into a legend that would make him seem invincible. And as the 1920s drew to a close, Luciano was preparing for the moves that would transform him from a lieutenant into the most powerful crime boss in America. The brutal Castellamarese War was about to begin, and Lucky Luciano was calculating how to emerge as the sole victor.
Part 3. The Calculated Betrayal. By the late 1920s, New York's criminal underworld was a powder keg. In 1928, a feud broke out between the Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano crime families. Dubbed the Castellamarese War after Maranzano's Sicilian hometown, the two-year struggle left dozens of mobsters dead. For most gangsters, the Castellamarese War was chaos, a bloody, destructive conflict that disrupted business and left bodies in the streets.
But for Charles Luciano, it was an opportunity. While others fought and died, he calculated, he observed, he planned. The conflict simmered through 1929. Luciano, along with several other younger Italian mobsters, thought working only with Italians limited the growth of their personal careers and the potential growth of the criminal empires. These men, known as the Young Turks, wanted to work with Jewish and Irish gangsters as long as the money was to be made. This was the fundamental divide. The old bosses, the mustache Petes as the younger gangsters derisively called them, clung to outdated ethnic loyalties. They refused to work with non-Sicilians, sometimes even refusing to work with Italians from other regions. They saw the Mafia as a cultural institution rooted in Sicilian tradition. Luciano saw it as a business, and in business, ethnic prejudice was simply bad for profits. His alliance with Meyer Lansky proved this point. During the 1920s, the prohibition of alcohol created opportunities for criminals to make a lot of money. Luciano became one of the big six of bootlegging, along with childhood friend Lansky, Siegel, Louis Lepke Buchalter, Jacob Gura Shapiro, and Abner Longy Zwillman. 3 of those 6 were Jewish. The mustache Petes would never have accepted such partnerships. But Luciano understood that Lansky's financial genius, Siegel's ruthlessness, and the connections of Buchalter and the others made them more valuable as partners than any Sicilian gangster who adhered to outdated traditions. While Masseria and Maranzano battled for supremacy, Luciano was building a cross-ethnic coalition that would outlast both of them. He was playing a different game entirely, not fighting for control of the old system, but preparing to create a new one. In early 1931, Luciano moved to eliminate Masseria. The war had been going badly for Masseria, and Luciano saw an opportunity to switch allegiance. In a secret deal with Maranzano, Luciano agreed to engineer Masseria's death in return for receiving Masseria's rackets and becoming Maranzano's second-in-command. This is where Luciano's calculating nature becomes most apparent. He didn't betray Masseria out of loyalty to Maranzano. He betrayed Masseria because Masseria was losing, and Luciano always positioned himself on the winning side. The deal with Maranzano was simply a stepping stone. On April 15, 1931, Luciano lured Masseria to a meeting where he was murdered at a restaurant called Nueva Villa Tomato. The details of that afternoon have become Mafia legend. Luciano took his boss to lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. They ate well: veal, pasta, wine. They played cards afterward, relaxing in the spring sunshine. Then Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. 4 gunmen, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel then walked into the dining room and shot and killed Masseria. Notice the calculation in every detail. Luciano chose a public restaurant rather than a private location. Witnesses would remember seeing them together, establishing his presence, but also his innocence. He ensured Masseria was relaxed, well-fed, distracted by cards. He positioned himself elsewhere when the shooting occurred, in the bathroom, unable to see or prevent what happened. When police questioned him, Luciano claimed he heard the shots but saw nothing. He was simply a lieutenant who had the misfortune of dining with his boss when unknown assassins struck. The perfect alibi, carefully constructed. But the truly brilliant calculation was yet to come. With Masseria dead, Luciano became the top leader in the New York Mafia. He worked for a stable distribution of power between 5 newly formed families. Wait, Maranzano dead? But Luciano had just made a deal with Maranzano to become his second-in-command. Exactly. That was never Luciano's endgame. It was simply the necessary first step. After Massaria's murder, Maranzano declared himself boss of all bosses and organized the Italian-American gangs in New York City into the 5 families. He held a grand meeting, announced his new title, and outlined his vision for a structured hierarchical mafia modeled on Julius Caesar's Roman legions. Luciano attended that meeting. He applauded, he accepted his position, and he immediately began planning Maranzano's murder. Why? Because Luciano understood something Maranzano didn't. The title Boss of All Bosses made Maranzano a target for every ambitious gangster in America. The old Sicilian had made himself the biggest target in the underworld while believing the title would protect him. Maranzano had won the Castellamarese War, but he had learned nothing from it. He still clung to ethnic divisions. He still demanded tribute and absolute obedience. He still thought in terms of the old Sicilian mafia rather than the new American reality. 6 months after Massaria's murder, on September 10, 1931, Luciano had Maranzano murdered by 4 Jewish gunmen loaned from Meyer Lansky. Again, notice the calculation. Luciano used Jewish gunmen, faces Maranzano's security wouldn't recognize, men who could pose as federal agents and gain access without suspicion. He waited exactly 6 months, long enough for Maranzano to feel secure in his position, but not long enough for Maranzano to consolidate power fully. The timing was perfect, the method was flawless. The result was that Luciano had become boss of all bosses without ever accepting or claiming the title. This is the essence of Luciano's genius. He became the most powerful crime boss in America by explicitly refusing the title that would have made him a target. He learned from Maranzano's mistake and did the opposite. With Maranzano dead, Luciano became the dominant crime boss in the U.S. Although there would have been few objections had Luciano declared himself capo di tutti capi, he chose to abolish the title, believing the position created trouble between the families and made himself a target for another ambitious challenger. In less than 6 months, Luciano had orchestrated the murders of the 2 most powerful mafia bosses in America. He had positioned himself as the dominant figure in organized crime, and he had done it all while maintaining the appearance of being simply a loyal lieutenant caught up in events beyond his control. This wasn't luck. This was perhaps the most calculated series of moves in the history of American organized crime. Lucky Luciano had played both sides, betrayed both bosses, and emerged as the undisputed power, all while never appearing to seek power at all. The question is, how did such a brilliant strategic mind end up in prison, convicted on prostitution charges, just 5 years after achieving absolute power? The answer reveals both Luciano's greatest strength and his fatal weakness.
Part 4. The Architect of the Commission. With Massaria and Maranzano dead, Lucky Luciano could have declared himself the new boss of all bosses. Every gangster in New York would have accepted it. He had the power, the connections, and the respect earned through 2 calculated betrayals that eliminated the old guard. But Luciano did something revolutionary instead. Although there would have been few objections had Luciano declared himself capo di tutti capi, he abolished the title, believing the position created trouble among the families and would make himself a target for another ambitious challenger. This decision reveals Luciano's understanding of power dynamics. He had just watched 2 bosses die because they claimed absolute authority. Mafia died because he refused to share power or adapt to changing circumstances. Maranzano died because declaring himself boss of all bosses painted a target on his back that every ambitious gangster could see. Luciano learned from their mistakes. Instead of claiming supreme authority, he would wield power through consensus, structure, and mutual profit.
Instead, Luciano chose to quietly maintain control by forging unofficial alliances with other bosses. At the same time, Luciano did not discard all of Maranzano's changes. He kept Maranzano's structure of 5 crime families in New York. The 5 families that Maranzano had created, Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese, would remain, but instead of answering to a single dictator, they would operate semi-independently, with disputes resolved through a new governing body, the Commission. A new national crime syndicate was spearheaded by Luciano to maintain peace between criminal organizations nationwide. Its board of directors included leaders of both Jewish and Italian criminal groups. This was Luciano's masterpiece of organization. The commission functioned like a corporate board of directors, with representatives from the major crime families voting on matters that affected organized crime as a whole. It established rules, mediated conflicts, approved major decisions like hits on made men, and ensured that the chaos of the Castellamarese War would never happen again. The brilliance lay in its structure. By including both Italian and Jewish gangsters, Luciano broke the ethnic barriers that had limited the Mafia's growth. By making decisions through consensus rather than dictatorship, he reduced the incentive for ambitious gangsters to stage coups. And by focusing on profit rather than honor or tradition, he aligned everyone's interests towards the same goal: making money. By 1934, he and the leaders of other crime families had developed the National Crime Syndicate, or cartel. The commission extended beyond New York, creating a truly national organization. Crime families in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and other cities all recognized the commission's authority because it benefited them to do so. Luciano became very influential in labor union activities and controlled the Manhattan waterfront, garbage hauling, construction, garment district businesses, and trucking. This diversification was another example of Luciano's calculated approach. While Prohibition had made fortunes through bootlegging, Luciano recognized that the law would eventually be repealed. Smart criminals needed multiple revenue streams. Labor racketeering, construction kickbacks, garbage collection, trucking, these were sustainable, long-term enterprises that would generate income regardless of what laws Congress passed. Genovese ultimately persuaded Luciano to keep the ceremony of becoming a made man in a crime family, arguing that young people needed rituals to promote obedience to the family. Luciano remained committed to omerta, the oath of silence, to protect the families from legal prosecution. Even here, Luciano's pragmatism shines through. He didn't particularly care about ceremonies or ancient rituals, but he understood their psychological power. The initiation ceremony, the blood oath, the promise of brotherhood, these rituals created loyalty and deterred betrayal. They were tools, like everything else in Luciano's arsenal, to be used when they served a purpose. In the early 1930s, Luciano lived in a penthouse suite at New York's Waldorf Towers, where he was registered as Charles Ross. This was Luciano at the peak of his power. He lived in luxury under an assumed name, appeared in nightclubs with Broadway starlets, wore custom-made suits, and ran an empire that generated millions of dollars annually. He became a well-known figure in Broadway social circles. He was always smartly dressed and kept a permanent room at the Waldorf Astoria. Here we see the beginning of Luciano's fatal flaw. For all his intelligence, for all his careful calculation, he couldn't resist the spotlight. The man who was smart enough to refuse the title of boss of all bosses was foolish enough to live like a celebrity gangster. He socialized with politicians, judges, and entertainers. He was photographed at nightclubs and restaurants. He became known, recognized, famous. For a criminal mastermind who had carefully avoided attention while engineering the murders of 2 major bosses, this public profile was a dangerous miscalculation. His lifestyle caught the attention of Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Thomas Dewey was young, ambitious, and determined to make a name for himself by prosecuting organized crime. He had watched Luciano operate for years, watched him beat charge after charge, watched him grow more powerful and more arrogant, and Dewey understood something crucial. If he could bring down Lucky Luciano, he could write his own ticket in politics. The collision between these two men, the calculating crime boss and the ambitious prosecutor, would define both their lives. Dewey couldn't touch Luciano for murder, racketeering, or bootlegging. The boss was too insulated, too careful, too protected by the code of silence. So Dewey would attack from an unexpected direction: prostitution. It seemed like a minor racket, beneath the attention of the boss of all bosses, but in Dewey's hands it would become the weapon that brought down the most powerful crime boss in America. Luciano calculated his way to the top of the underworld. Now he would discover that even the most brilliant criminal mind can make fatal mistakes. The question wasn't whether he would fall, it was whether he could calculate his way out of prison once Dewey finally caught him. The answer would reshape both their lives and change the course of American organized crime forever.
Part 5. The Prostitution Trap. In 1935, Charles Lucky Luciano was sitting pretty as the de facto head of the Commission, a powerful syndicate of New York City's 5 largest organized crime families. Luciano had forged a working peace between the families and become immensely wealthy through the mob's long reach into drug dealing, loan sharking, lotteries, and other illegal activities. At the height of his power, Luciano seemed untouchable. He had survived assassination attempts, eliminated rivals, built a national crime syndicate, and accumulated a fortune estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. He lived in luxury at the Waldorf Towers, socialized with celebrities, and operated with apparent impunity. But Thomas Dewey was watching, waiting, and calculating his own move. Although Luciano managed to fend off threats from rivals and authorities to that point, his luck ran dry when he came up against the trailblazing black lawyer Eunice Hunton Carter. This is one of history's fascinating ironies. The man called Lucky was brought down not by a rival gangster or a veteran detective, but by a brilliant black female prosecutor who noticed patterns that others had missed. Carter was named to a team convened by Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey to crack down on mob activity, called the 20 Against the Underworld. She would be the only black and female lawyer among them. Dewey initially had little interest in prostitution cases. They seemed minor compared to murder, extortion, and racketeering. But Carter sensed a pattern from the numerous complaints about specific brothels being ignored by police. She thought back to her time in the women's courts, when the appearance of a lawyer named Abe Karp seemingly always led to an arresting officer forgetting key details and the dismissal of charges. What Carter recognized was organization. The prostitution trade in New York wasn't random independent operators, it was systematized, protected, controlled from above. The same lawyers appeared again and again, the same bondsmen posted bail, the same judges seemed unusually forgiving. It wasn't coincidence, it was structure. Carter patiently continued to collect evidence. Combining citizens' tips with the catalogs of the Committee of 14, a defunct group that had attempted to curtail prostitution, Carter compiled a thorough index of brothels throughout the city. Additionally, her many interviews established an understanding of how the mob had taken control of the business a few years earlier, with workers now prompted to pay a weekly bond fee. This was the wedge Dewey needed. Luciano had insulated himself brilliantly from his more serious crimes. Witnesses to murders disappeared or refused to testify. Financial records for bootlegging and gambling operations were destroyed or hidden. But prostitution left a paper trail. Bail records, court documents, payoffs, the testimony of women who could be convinced to talk.
In order to cast an unshakable aura upon their target, the prosecution team alleged that Luciano was the primary mindmaster and beneficiary of a nationally syndicated sex trafficking racket, what was then commonly called white slavery. The approach built from a belief that Luciano's mob evolved from extorting independent prostitutes and brothels to taking them over outright, thus controlling every element of the estimated $12 million per year underworld business. $12 million per year from prostitution alone. By the mid-1930s, that was equivalent to more than $200 million in today's money. This wasn't a minor racket, it was a major revenue stream, run with the same organizational efficiency Luciano had brought to every criminal enterprise. Dewey's staff interviewed whores, pimps, loan sharks, and strong-arm men. Word reached Luciano. Many had talked. He disappeared. Here we see Luciano's calculating mind at work again. When he learned that Dewey was building a case, he didn't stay and fight. He ran. In March 1936, Luciano fled New York after being alerted by a friendly desk clerk that two men who looked like detectives were on their way up to see him. He drove to Philadelphia, changed cars, and borrowed $25,000 from friends. Then he drove to Cleveland, where he took the train to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Hot Springs was a sanctuary. Luciano was found in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where organized crime maintained a well-protected sanctuary. The town was controlled by mobsters, and the local authorities were thoroughly corrupted. Luciano could have stayed there indefinitely, protected by a network of corruption that stretched from the police to the governor's office. But he was extradited only after Dewey pictured the Arkansas governor as a protector of gangsters, and 20 Arkansas Rangers removed Luciano from the protection of the Hot Springs sheriff. Dewey played the publicity game brilliantly. He made it a national scandal that a governor would protect America's most notorious gangster. He generated headlines, put pressure on Arkansas authorities, and eventually forced them to hand over Luciano. Luciano was held by authorities in Hot Springs while his lawyers fought to avoid, or at the very least, delay the extradition. They managed to hold Dewey's troop at bay until April 18th, when Luciano was whisked back to New York on a train under heavy police guard. The trial would become a media sensation, pitting the nation's most powerful crime boss against its most ambitious prosecutor. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Dewey had built his case carefully, using Carter's groundwork to construct an airtight prosecution. Prostitute Florence "Cokie Flo" Brown took the stand and claimed she overheard Luciano and other so-called bookers of the ring. She recounted a specific conversation in which Luciano allegedly proclaimed a desire to unify whorehouses into a chain similar to supermarkets. "I'm going to organize the cat houses like the A&P," she testified Luciano had said. Whether or not Luciano actually said those words, the quote perfectly captured his approach to crime: organization, efficiency, consolidation. The A&P supermarket chain had revolutionized grocery retail through standardization and economies of scale. Luciano was applying the same principles to prostitution. But the testimony was devastating. Witness after witness, prostitutes, madams, bookers, testified about the organization that controlled them. They described the bond system, the protection payments, the enforcers who ensured compliance, and they named Lucky Luciano as the man at the top. On June 6, 1936, Luciano was found guilty of 62 charges of compulsory prostitution in Manhattan. He was handed down a sentence of 30 to 50 years. It was the longest sentence ever given to someone for pimping. 30 to 50 years for a man who committed dozens of murders, who engineered the deaths of two major mafia bosses, who ran a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was going to prison not for murder or racketeering, but for prostitution. The irony was not lost on Luciano or anyone else in the underworld. The calculating mind-master who had avoided prosecution for his most serious crimes had been brought down by what he considered a minor racket. But was this really bad luck? Or was it the inevitable consequence of Luciano's own miscalculation? He had grown too visible, too comfortable, too confident that his insulation from major crimes would protect him from everything. He had failed to anticipate that an ambitious prosecutor would attack from an unexpected angle, using witnesses who feared prison more than they feared the mob. For the first time in his adult life, Lucky Luciano had been outmaneuvered. And as he entered Sing Sing prison in June 1936, he must have wondered, was there any calculation that could get him out again?
Part 6. The Calculated Patriot. On June 18, 1936, Lucky Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, to begin serving his 30 to 50-year sentence. For most men, this would be the end of the story. At 39 years old, Luciano faced the prospect of dying in prison. But even behind bars, Luciano's calculating mind continued to work. He couldn't control the outside world the way he had before, but he could still influence it. He maintained contact with his organization through carefully managed visitors and coded messages. He ensured that his interests were protected, that his position in the commission remained secure. Most importantly, he waited for an opportunity. And that opportunity came from the most unexpected source: World War II. In 1942, the U.S. military faced a serious problem. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships along the East Coast with alarming regularity. The port of New York, crucial for military shipments to Europe, was vulnerable to sabotage. The Navy needed intelligence about potential threats and wanted cooperation from the dock workers who might notice suspicious activity. The problem was simple. The docks were controlled by the mob, specifically by Luciano's organization. Dock workers answered to mobsters, not to military authorities. If the Navy wanted cooperation, they needed to deal with organized crime. In February 1942, the luxury ocean liner SS Normandy, which was being converted to a U.S. warship, mysteriously burned and capsized in New York Harbor. Although the cause was determined to have been accidental, authorities suspected sabotage by German spies or U-boat crew members. The Navy had a problem. German U-boats were already sinking Allied ships with alarming regularity. The docks were crucial for military shipments to Europe, and authorities were particularly concerned that pro-fascist sympathizers of Benito Mussolini lurked among the Italian immigrants who worked as longshoremen in New York. The Navy needed cooperation from the dock workers, but the docks were controlled by the mob. In March 1942, with the recruitment of Fulton Fish Market kingpin Joseph "Sox" Lanza, naval intelligence officers launched the top-secret Operation Underworld. However, Lanza explained that their cooperation could be secured by the imprisoned mobster Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who still wielded absolute power on the docks even after 6 years behind bars. The Navy approached Luciano through his attorney, Moses Polikoff. Intelligence officers offered better prison conditions in exchange for Luciano's help securing the docks. But Luciano wasn't interested in better conditions. He wanted freedom. The Navy couldn't promise that, not immediately, but they could dangle the possibility. The implicit understanding that cooperation during wartime might lead to executive clemency afterward. Luciano calculated the odds. He was facing 20 to 40 more years in prison. The war wouldn't last forever. If he helped the Navy, if his assistance proved valuable, if he played this correctly, there might be a way out. Luciano agreed.
The Navy moved him from Dannemora to Great Meadow Prison in May 1942, closer to New York City and easier for his associates to visit. This transfer was carefully orchestrated. The Navy relocated Luciano and several decoy inmates to ensure that the other crime families wouldn't suspect he had cooperated with authorities. Meyer Lansky became Luciano's connection to the outside world. Luciano gave Joseph Sachs Lanza permission to use his name on the streets. Within days, the underworld fell in line. First to join was Joseph Ryan, president of the International Longshoremen's Association. Next was Albert Anastasia, the High Lord Executioner himself. Lieutenant Maurice Kelly, a former New York Police Department officer, testified that from the time Commander Haffenden made these contacts with Luciano, there was a very open and cooperative condition that existed between the investigators and the people that were very influential on the various docks in the port of New York. Dock strikes stopped after Luciano became involved. No major acts of sabotage occurred in New York Harbor for the rest of the war. Was this luck, or was it the calculated move of a criminal genius who recognized an opportunity when he saw one? Luciano transformed his imprisonment from a death sentence into a bargaining chip. He leveraged his underworld influence, which he had carefully maintained even from behind bars, into value for the U.S. government. But Luciano's calculation extended beyond mere waterfront security. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Sicily in 1943, planners realized they lacked Italian-speaking specialists, reliable local contacts, and practical on-the-ground knowledge. Once again, the Navy turned to Luciano. Through underworld contacts, they developed points of contact on the island. A small Italian-speaking team was assembled and sent to support the invasion. Luciano's associates found numerous Sicilians to help naval intelligence draw maps of the harbors of Sicily and dig up old snapshots of the coastline. They provided names of trusted contacts inside the Sicilian Mafia, who also wanted to see Mussolini toppled. Here we see Luciano's strategic brilliance. The Sicilian Mafia hated Mussolini. By 1928, fascists had arrested over 11,000 suspected Mafia members and driven many more to flee Sicily. Luciano wasn't betraying the Mafia by helping the invasion. He was helping them take revenge on fascism while simultaneously earning points with the American government. The effectiveness of Luciano's contribution remains debated. Scholars like Selwyn Rabb have questioned whether Luciano could have helped during the invasion of Sicily, as he was out of touch with the Sicilian Mafia. But the 1954 Herlands investigation concluded there can be no question about the value of this project, and that Luciano's liberty had been well earned. What's undeniable is that Luciano turned his war cooperation into freedom. On January 3, 1946, Governor Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on condition that he be deported to Italy. The same prosecutor who had put Luciano in prison now set him free. After serving only 9.5 years of his 30 to 50-year sentence, lucky Luciano walked out of prison. This wasn't luck. This was the calculated exploitation of a world war to engineer his own release. Even in defeat, convicted, imprisoned, seemingly finished, Luciano had found a way to win. That's not fortune, that's genius.
Part 7. The Exile's Empire. On February 9, 1946, Lucky Luciano boarded the SS Laura Keene in Brooklyn and sailed for Italy. He was 48 years old, no longer imprisoned, but no longer American either. The condition of his release was explicit. He would be deported to Italy and could never return to the United States.
For most criminals, exile would be the end of power. Cut off from their organization, their territory, their sources of income, they would fade into obscurity. But Luciano was not most criminals. The boat docked in Genoa, Italy in early February 1946. For most men, exile would be the end of power, but Luciano had already calculated his next move. In early fall 1946, Luciano received a sealed envelope from a recently deported U.S. mafioso, which contained 3 words: December, Hotel Nacional. In late September, Luciano obtained 2 Italian passports issued in his real name, Salvatore Lucania, with visas for Mexico, Cuba, and several South American nations. On October 29, 1946, less than 8 months after being deported, Luciano arrived by air in Camagüey, Cuba. He had circumvented his exile through a simple calculation. The terms of his deportation said he couldn't return to the United States, but they said nothing about Cuba. Cuba in 1946 was a criminal paradise. Gambling was legal and casinos were proliferating. The government was corrupt and easily bribed. American tourists flocked to Havana for the nightlife and entertainment. And most importantly, it was only 90 miles from Florida, close enough to maintain control of his American operations. Meyer Lansky greeted his old friend on his arrival in Cuba. Lansky quickly suggested that Luciano purchase a $150,000 interest in the Hotel Nacional, a plush casino and hotel owned by Lansky and his silent partner, Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. Luciano agreed. Following Luciano's orders, Lansky organized a conference in Havana the week of December 22 of crime bosses from all over the United States. The Havana conference was held at the Hotel Nacional during the week of December 22, 1946. The delegates began arriving in December. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, Meyer Lansky, all the major figures in American organized crime made the journey to Havana to pay homage to Lucky Luciano, the man they still recognized as their ultimate leader despite his deportation. To welcome Luciano back from exile and acknowledge his continued authority within the mob, all the conference invitees brought Luciano cash envelopes. These Christmas presents totaled more than $200,000. The official cover story for the Havana conference was that the mobsters were attending a gala party with Frank Sinatra as the entertainment. Sinatra flew to Havana with Al Capone cousins Charlie, Rocco, and Joseph Fischetti from Chicago. Charlie and Rocco Fischetti delivered a suitcase containing $2 million to Luciano, his share of the U.S. rackets he still controlled. $2 million. In cash, while officially deported and living in exile. This wasn't luck, this was Luciano demonstrating that his power transcended geography. Even from Cuba, he controlled his organization, collected tribute, and commanded respect. The conference addressed crucial matters: the expansion of casino operations in Cuba and Las Vegas, narcotics trafficking routes, and the most explosively, the fate of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who was suspected of skimming money from the Flamingo Hotel construction. But the most significant item on the agenda was internal politics. Vito Genovese, who had been running Luciano's family in his absence, wanted permanent control. Genovese attended the conference with ambitions to permanently supplant Luciano's influence. Luciano decisively reasserted his authority. He leveraged personal alliances with key attendees, including Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis, who owed their positions to his earlier innovations in organized crime governance. Genovese's power play was crushed. Luciano also decided to resurrect the boss of all bosses position and claim it for himself. It was a calculated reversal of his 1931 decision to abolish the title. But circumstances had changed. From exile, Luciano needed symbolic authority to maintain real power. For a brief, glorious moment, Lucky Luciano had everything. He lived in luxury at the Hotel Nacional, 90 miles from the United States, but effectively still ruling his empire. He socialized with celebrities, operated casinos, controlled narcotics routes, and commanded the American Mafia from his Caribbean sanctuary. It was perfect, too perfect, and it couldn't last. Harry Anslinger, director of the Federal Narcotics Administration, learned of Luciano's presence in Cuba and was outraged. The U.S. government applied pressure to the Cuban government by cutting off a shipment of much-needed medicinal drugs to the island, threatening to hold them indefinitely until the crime boss was arrested and sent back to Italy. Cuba had no choice. On February 23, 1947, Luciano was arrested at a restaurant in Havana. On March 20, 1947, Luciano boarded a Turkish freighter headed back to Europe. His time in Cuba had lasted less than 5 months, but in those months he had reasserted his dominance, collected millions of dollars, and proven that even in exile he remained the calculating mastermind of American organized crime. Was his arrest bad luck, or was it the inevitable result of being too visible, too public, too unable to resist the spotlight? Luciano had survived by being smart, but he had a fatal weakness. He loved being Lucky Luciano. He couldn't help but live large, be seen, be recognized. And that vanity, more than any prosecutor or law enforcement agency, would keep him in permanent exile for the rest of his life.
Part 8. The Final Calculation. Lucky Luciano would never again leave Italy. For the remaining 15 years of his life, he lived in Naples under constant police surveillance. The Italian government restricted his movements, required him to report to police regularly, and repeatedly investigated him for narcotics trafficking. But even in these constrained circumstances, Luciano remained calculating. In 1948, he met Igea Lissoni, a Milanese ballerina 20 years younger than him, whom he later described as the love of his life. The relationship was tumultuous. Luciano continued his womanizing and at times turned abusive, but Lissoni provided companionship in his exile. When Lissoni died of breast cancer in 1959, Luciano was devastated. He had never married, never had children. "I didn't want no son of mine to go through life as the son of Luciano, the gangster," he explained. "That's one thing I still hate Dewey for, making me a gangster in the eyes of the world." This statement reveals something profound about Luciano's self-perception. He had spent his entire adult life as a criminal, murdering rivals, corrupting officials, building a vast illegal enterprise. But he saw himself not as a gangster, but as a businessman who operated outside the law, out of necessity, not choice. It's the ultimate act of self-deception, or perhaps the ultimate calculation, maintaining the internal narrative that allowed him to function without remorse, to make ruthless decisions without being crushed by guilt. Throughout the 1950s, Luciano faced constant harassment from Italian and American authorities. July 1949, arrested in Rome on suspicion of narcotics trafficking. Released after a week without charges, but permanently banned from visiting Rome. June 1951, questioned by police in Naples for 20 hours about $57,000 in cash and a new American car. Released without charges.
May 1952, the Italian government revoked Luciano's passport after complaints from U.S. and Canadian law enforcement. November 1954, an Italian judicial commission applied strict limits on Luciano for 2 years. He was required to report to police every Sunday, stay home every night, and not leave Naples without permission. Each restriction tightened the noose. Luciano, who had once ruled New York from a penthouse at the Waldorf Towers, was now confined to Naples, unable to travel, constantly watched. But he adapted. He continued to receive visitors, American tourists, sailors, journalists. He frequently professed his love for the United States and his desire to return. Whether this was genuine sentiment or calculated public relations is impossible to know. Perhaps both. From Naples, Luciano allegedly continued to direct drug trafficking operations into the United States through what would later be known as the French Connection. He couldn't visit America, but his influence reached across the ocean. Even in exile, even under surveillance, he remained a player. In October 1957, police raided a meeting of American Mafia bosses in Appalachian, New York. The exposure of this gathering brought unprecedented attention to organized crime. Senate investigations followed. The Mafia that Luciano had created, structured, organized, operating like a corporation, was now under intense scrutiny. Luciano watched from Naples as his creation faced its greatest challenge. He saw Vito Genovese, the man who had challenged him in Havana, finally take control of the Luciano family in 1957 after Frank Costello stepped down. He saw his longtime friend Albert Anastasia gunned down in a barber shop, making way for Carlo Gambino to take over that family. The empire he had built was evolving without him. New bosses were rising, old alliances were shifting, and Luciano, the man who had calculated every move so perfectly, was powerless to influence events directly. But he had one final move to make. The last meeting. On January 26, 1962, 64-year-old Lucky Luciano went to Capodichino International Airport in Naples. He had arranged to meet with American film producer Martin Gosch, who wanted to make a film about his life. This was classic Luciano, thinking about legacy, about how he would be remembered, about controlling the narrative even in death. A film would cement his place in history, would tell his story the way he wanted it told. Unknown to Luciano, Italian drug agents were also at the airport, waiting to arrest him in connection with an international narcotics smuggling operation. After years of surveillance and repeated accusations, they finally believed they had evidence to make charges stick. After meeting with Gosch, Luciano began walking through the airport, and then he collapsed. A heart attack. Sudden, massive, fatal. Luciano died at the scene, age 64. Was it simply biological fate, a lifetime of cigars, rich food, stress finally catching up? Or did the stress of knowing arrest was imminent trigger the attack? We'll never know. What we do know is this: Lucky Luciano died before he could be arrested, before he could face trial, before his final years could be spent in an Italian prison. He died a free man, on his feet, still calculating his next move. Even his death seemed perfectly timed. The return. 300 people attended Luciano's funeral service in Naples. His body was transported through the streets in a horse-drawn black hearse. Then, with permission from the U.S. government, Luciano's relatives brought his body back to New York for burial. The man who had been deported in 1946 with explicit orders never to return finally came home in a casket. More than 2,000 mourners attended his funeral at St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Carlo Gambino, who had risen to become head of the Gambino family, gave the eulogy. The commission sent flowers. The criminal empire that Luciano had created paid its final respects. He was buried not under his famous name, but under his birth name, Salvatore Luciana, the boy from Sicily who had become Lucky Luciano, who had built an empire, who had survived impossible odds. He was laid to rest as the person he had been before all the calculation, all the violence, all the power.
Part 9. The Calculated Legacy. Lucky Luciano was never lucky. Every supposed stroke of fortune in his life was the result of careful planning, strategic thinking, and ruthless execution. The 1929 attack that gave him his nickname? He survived not through luck, but because he was smart enough to know when to talk and when to stay silent, tough enough to endure torture without breaking, and cunning enough to use the incident to build a legend that served him for decades. His rise to power? Not lucky timing, but calculated betrayals. He engineered Massaria's murder precisely when Massaria was weakest and Maranzano seemed strongest. Then he eliminated Maranzano exactly 6 months later, long enough to consolidate support, short enough to prevent Maranzano from becoming unassailable. The commission and the 5 families? Pure organizational genius. Luciano understood that the boss of all bosses title was a target, so he abolished it while maintaining de facto control through a structure that appeared democratic but was actually designed to protect and empower him. His prison release? Not a lucky break from a grateful government, but a calculated exchange. Luciano leveraged World War II to transform his greatest weakness, imprisonment, into value for the U.S. military. He secured his freedom not through fortune, but through strategic cooperation that benefited him more than it benefited the government. His Cuban adventure? A brilliant exploitation of a legal loophole. He was forbidden to return to the United States, but nothing in his deportation order mentioned Cuba. For 5 glorious months, he operated 90 miles from America, collecting millions while thumbing his nose at the authorities who thought they'd neutralized him. Every move was calculated, every decision was strategic. The man called Lucky succeeded through intelligence, planning, and the ruthless elimination of anyone who stood in his way. The true genius. But Luciano's greatest calculation was perhaps the most subtle. He understood that being thought lucky was better than being recognized as brilliant. When people think you're lucky, they underestimate you. They attribute your success to chance rather than skill. They don't prepare adequately to face you. They wait for your luck to run out instead of actively trying to outmaneuver you. The nickname Lucky was perfect camouflage for a criminal genius. While rivals and law enforcement chalked up his success to fortune, Luciano was systematically building the most sophisticated criminal organization America had ever seen. He studied his enemies. He anticipated their moves. He created structures that would outlast him. He forged alliances across ethnic lines when everyone else was trapped in old-world prejudices. He transformed a chaotic collection of street gangs into a national crime syndicate that operated like a Fortune 500 company. Compare Luciano to his contemporaries. Al Capone was flashy, violent, and ultimately destroyed by his own visibility. He died of syphilis in 1947, broken and brain-damaged, his empire long since dismantled. Dutch Schultz was volatile and unpredictable. The commission ordered his murder in 1935 because he was too dangerous to control.
Salvatore Maranzano declared himself boss of all bosses and died 6 months later, betrayed by those he believed were his allies. Vito Genovese finally took control of Luciano's family in 1957, only to be arrested in 1959 and die in prison in 1969. Luciano outlasted them all. He died a free man at age 64 after decades at the pinnacle of organized crime. His empire continued long after his death. The commission he created still exists. The 5 families he organized still operate. The structure he designed proved so effective that it became the template for organized crime worldwide. That's not luck. That's legacy. The flaws in the calculation. But for all his genius, Luciano made 3 critical miscalculations that prevented him from achieving total victory. First, vanity. He couldn't resist the spotlight. From his penthouse at the Waldorf Towers to his nightclub appearances with Frank Sinatra in Havana, Luciano lived publicly when he should have lived in shadows. This visibility made him a target for ambitious prosecutors like Thomas Dewey and obsessive law enforcement like Harry Anslinger. Second, trust. Despite his calculating nature, Luciano maintained personal relationships that left him vulnerable. His friendship with Meyer Lansky was genuine but potentially exploitable. His love for Igea Lissoni was real but made him emotionally vulnerable. His loyalty to the commission structure prevented him from taking the absolute power that might have protected him better. Third, America. Luciano loved the United States in a way that hampered his strategic thinking. His constant professions of wanting to return, his attempts to stay in Cuba rather than accepting permanent exile in Italy, his final resting place in Queens, all suggest that beneath the cold calculation was genuine attachment to America that he couldn't entirely suppress. These weren't fatal flaws. He died free, wealthy, and powerful. But they were the cracks in his armor, the points where emotion penetrated calculation, where the man underneath the legend showed through. The final assessment. Charles "Lucky" Luciano wasn't lucky. He was perhaps the most calculating criminal mind of the 20th century. He transformed American organized crime from scattered ethnic gangs to a national syndicate. He created structures that outlasted him by decades. He survived betrayals, assassination attempts, imprisonment, and exile, not through fortune, but through intelligence and strategy. The nickname was brilliant misdirection. While everyone looked for his luck to run out, Luciano was building an empire that would define organized crime in America for generations. He didn't get lucky. He calculated every move, planned every betrayal, engineered every rise and survival. Lucky Luciano was never lucky. He was smart, ruthless, and strategic. And that made him far more dangerous than mere luck ever could.
Epilogue: The man behind the myth. In the end, what do we really know about Salvatore Lucania, the boy from Sicily who became Charles "Lucky" Luciano? We know the facts. Born November 24, 1897, emigrated to America in 1906. Arrested 25 times between 1916 and 1936, built the commission, created the 5 families, convicted of prostitution charges in 1936, released in 1946, deported, died January 26, 1962. But who was he really? Behind the expensive suits and the calculated violence, behind the strategic betrayals and the organizational genius, who was the man? He never married, never had children,
He said it was to protect them from his legacy, but perhaps it was also because true intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is incompatible with calculation. He loved America, but could never return. He built an empire, but had to watch it evolve without him. He accumulated millions, but spent his final years confined to Naples, under constant surveillance, unable to enjoy his wealth freely. He died meeting with a film producer, still trying to control his narrative, still calculating how he would be remembered. And perhaps that's the most revealing detail of all. Even facing death, Luciano was thinking about legacy, about how the story would be told. The story we've told here is of a calculating genius who built modern organized crime. But it's also the story of a 10-year-old immigrant boy who learned that crime was the only path to escape poverty, who built protection and power because he'd seen what happened to those without it, who created structures because chaos had nearly killed him multiple times. Lucky Luciano wasn't lucky, but perhaps that's precisely why he needed people to think he was. The nickname was armor, protection, a way to deflect attention from the cold, ruthless calculation that actually drove his success. In the end, he got exactly what he calculated for: power, wealth, and a legacy that endures long after his death. Not luck, never luck, always calculation.